Welcome back to the Literacy Lunch Break. I'm your host, Marjorie Botari. Today we are talking with Dr. Julie Behmer, and we are going to talk all things writing. Before we jump into that topic of writing, I would love for you, Julie, to introduce yourself, give us a little background about your experience in education and what led you to where you are now.
Thank you so much for having me, Marjorie. My background is a winding path, as I think many people end up having. Education for me is a second career. So initially, I was a paralegal for 14 years and decided not to continue pursuing that route. There were a variety of factors that led me into teaching, including a long line of teachers in my family, including my husband and both of my parents. So I went back to school when my girls were in elementary school and did that whole reinventing myself thing. Went into special education because I just really felt a strong pull to that. So then I worked as a special ed teacher for a grand total of 14 years in a district. Part of those years were also as a special education teacher consultant. So in that role, I was really involved in working with general education teachers to help give them strategies and ideas of things to do in their classroom, as well as leading the majority of the multidisciplinary team meetings. I was helping special ed teachers and gen ed teachers when it came to those meetings and working to foster the relationships with the families and the parents of the students that we were evaluating for eligibility. During those 14 years, especially because I was in special education, my experience spanned everywhere from kindergarten, not homeschooling, that's what parents do, but I was working as a home care provider for a student who was unable to attend school all the way up through 8th grade. So I worked at every one of those grade levels to some degree over those 14 years. The majority of my time, though, was spent at the middle school level. And I know a lot of people, perhaps outside of education, but some within as well, kind of cringe at the idea of middle school, but it was absolutely my favorite age.
I love that.
So part of what ended up leading me down the path to end up where I am today was a particular student, seems like there's always one, who, because I bounced around a lot and I was moved to where the need was in the district, I would encounter students multiple times. So this was one in particular who I was involved in his initial qualifying for special education services when he was in later elementary school. Was one of those situations where the family had found the funds to pay for an outside diagnosis to have him officially labeled as a student struggling with dyslexia. I came across him again in middle school, and it seemed like there still just wasn't enough being done because the teachers lacked the knowledge of really what to do. So that's when I kind of started doing my own deep dive, and I went through a training out of San Diego to learn a methodology aligned with Orton Gillingham. It wasn't OG per se. And then I felt like this is why did I not know this as a special ed teacher? I felt like, especially in special education, this is something I should be really knowledgeable of. So I continued exploring all of those options and ended up landing myself in a PhD program because it sounded fun. My youngest daughter at the time was leaving for college, and I thought, what else am I going to do with my time? So I embarked on that adventure, which I would not use the word fun to describe it any longer, but so impactful in my life and my trajectory. So I ended up, while I was pursuing my PhD, I left the classroom and went to work for the Michigan Department of Education. March 8th, 2020 was the day I started there, if that rings a bell for people. 5 days later, we were all, 5 work days later, we were all working from home for an undetermined amount of time, learning a new job, learning a new role, and continuing with my PhD. A couple of years down the road, one of my colleagues from my PhD program had just come to Saginaw Valley State University, where I am now, and she's a literacy professor. And she contacted me and said, we're hiring another one. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Thank you so much for thinking of me, but I don't think that's what I want to do. And here I am in my third year here.
Right?
And I absolutely love it. I'm so happy to be back teaching. I know it's not the same kind of teaching with, younger students, but I love preparing our future educators.
Hmm.
And I feel like what landed me here and changed my mind when I initially said that wasn't what I wanted to do was realizing I left the classroom to go to the Department of Education because I thought perhaps I could have a bigger outreach and
Right.
impact more students across the state by working with those districts. And to a degree that happened. But then when I started looking at the opportunities that higher education provided and preparing future educators and sharing this wealth of knowledge that I feel I've accumulated and don't want to hold on to, because hopefully thousands of children down the road will be able to benefit from what I can share with them and they can practice and learn and take into their classrooms. So that was a long explanation of how I landed where I
No,
am.
that I mean, I always love hearing the background because I think that is so important of how we got to where we are. And I think, as you said, it is a winding road for many of us, right? Because,
Yes.
um, so many of the guests on the podcast, we're searching for answers. We're trying to figure out what knowledge we're missing or how we can support students. And we recognize we're missing knowledge and we keep going back to school. I know,
Yes. Yes. I think
doctorate is
I'm done
something
now.
I've been wanting to do, but my husband's like, no, we have to pay for our kids to go to school. You have to stop going. So just the master's degrees. But when we think about that teacher prep, right? Like that is something you mentioned. And I'm so grateful for professors like you because that's a piece that we kind of touch on like, oh yeah, we know we need to prepare teachers better. But then when we're looking to make that change, not often are we thinking, well, okay, maybe this is a path that I can take to ensure that this change happens. Because yes, we can have it at the state level, we can have it even at the national level, but if teachers are going into classrooms and they're being prepared to teach and we're not providing the instruction that's necessary, as you
Hmm.
said, how many teachers have said, why didn't I know this? Gen
Yes.
ed and especially special ed. Um,
Absolutely.
so as you think about that, and as you've been providing instruction, I know this series we talk about literacy and kind of that reading strand quite often, but what often kind of gets left out, and I think because it's kind of scary to teach,
Hmm.
is that writing aspect. And so
Hmm.
I think as we think about, reading, we can kind of be really specific with those foundational skills, really, very clear cut, concise. Writing seems a little bit, harder and kind of maybe just like a little bit muddier when we look at that instruction. And so as you think about preparing pre-service teachers, what are some crucial components that you think need to be part of that course of preparing students or preparing teachers to teach?
So I think you nailed it when you said it's challenging, it's overwhelming, it's intimidating, and I think that there are a number of reasons for that. The research that has been done in writing is far less than what has been done in
Hmm.
reading,
Yes.
and consequently, the instruction that's happening in teacher prep programs tends to fall very much heavier on reading than writing because there's a lot more to draw from. And, we have all of these things that have been happening. Writing instruction has been raised to the level of, media at a level that I don't think that we've seen before, but
Hmm.
nobody talks about writing.
Right.
And the research supports that. We know, I think a couple different factors are at play here. Number one, what we don't really think about initially is why is writing so intimidating and so challenging? And we don't really break it down into understanding the tremendous cognitive load it places on our brain. I know that sounds like a really
Yeah.
lofty thing to say, but here's what I mean by that. Dr. Young-Suk Kim has a great graphic that shows all the different planes that are at play when we're writing. So we have to take in so many things. We are sorting out in our brains the what do we want to say. It starts with
Right.
that, right? Which means we have to have a basic understanding of what we're being asked to write or what we want, what we're choosing to write about. We have to have the knowledge of the content. We also have to sort through what does that look like when I write it? Are there certain text structures that I should be following? Then we have to go through the more fine motor side of things of how do we get those ideas down on either paper or screen. So that's a whole different level. And then we have all these rules we have to follow grammatically. We have to know, are we varying our sentence structure? Do we have a complete paragraph? What's a topic sentence? So there are so many layers at play. And then just for fun, we throw in the executive functioning that has to happen whenever we're being asked to do any task. So how well are we attending to what we're doing?
Yeah.
How distracted are we in our environment? So um, it is really the most challenging thing that we ask our students and ourselves to do. So for that reason, just that basic understanding, we need to begin instruction looking at a couple different things. We need to peel back first the fears. We need pre-service teachers and in-service teachers both
Right.
to reflect on, how do I perceive myself as a writer? Perception, self-efficacy are huge components, because if we constantly tell ourselves it's challenging and we can't, that's probably what's going to happen.
Right. Yes.
So self-talk and motivation comes into play, self-regulation, having our pre-service teachers understand how to do that themselves is a critical starting point, because then they can model it for their students as well. So there's that part. There's understanding the different text structures and different genres of what we're being asked to write, because persuasive writing and expository writing or informational writing can look kind of similar in structure, depending on how advanced the student is, and how much we're looking for different things in a persuasive essay than an informative essay. And those both look very different than a narrative writing piece.
Right.
So we have to understand what the flow is, what the expectations are, what the structures are. So we need to make sure our pre-service teachers understand those things. One of the other really big components is understanding the deep connection between reading and writing. We start with the basics, the foundational skills that you mentioned in reading, where we understand what phonemes are and what graphemes are.
Right.
But we need to be bringing the writing in even more so in that early phonics instruction, so that spelling can be integrated so much easier when we do that, when we're learning the rules of phonics and we're learning how they apply to writing them. The writing tends to lag behind the reading development overall anyway. So the more that we can integrate those two things, the more long-term benefits we're going to see. And then when we also consider for higher level, and it doesn't even have to be upper elementary, it can be lower elementary as well. Most of our state writing assessments are asking students to respond to a prompt. So that should be a lot of the practice we're giving in classrooms, and that should be what our pre-service teachers are learning as well. When we do that, and we're engaging in close reading activities as part of our writing and as part of we are deepening our reading comprehension tremendously. So we can really benefit what our overall goal is with reading through writing. They complement each other so strongly. Right. And the research has been there for a long time, but it just seems like for whatever reason, it has not been raised to the level of awareness. Yes. So let's see. So we really need to explore and make sure our pre-service teachers have the knowledge of the writing content, which can be varied across genres. And we need to also make sure they understand the pedagogical side of writing instruction. How do you go about teaching it? So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. And from the writing knowledge standpoint, they've probably never heard the terms transcription skills and translation skills, and they don't understand the difference. So let's start there. It can be reduced to simply to, looking at the simple view of writing and comparing it to the simple view of reading, which I think and I hope a lot of teacher prep programs are starting to teach now, because that's the direction that things are moving, and we at least need to understand the factors at play. And we also need to understand that both of those models are anything but simple, that they just represent larger categories. And then we can break down all of those components and really have our students understand what all is at play.
Right. And I love that you brought in, the writing rope and the reading rope, because yes, and I always just like to share, that's not exhaustive, right? Because what you mentioned, even as we talk about, the reading rope, is it's not bringing in the executive functioning skills, the ability to focus, all of those pieces as well. So nobody's saying this is an exhaustive visual, but it's a really great visual to show, as you talked about that cognitive load, especially for writing. And so if we're going to support students and even ourselves with our instruction, identifying which thread really students need more support with, what instruction needs to take place. My next question, I had asked about pre-service teachers, and the next question was going to be current teachers. And I heard you mention multiple things that really do lend themselves to both pre-service and classroom teachers.
Hmm.
As we know, we go into teaching and there's still a lot for us to learn. So,
Yes, yes.
we have many educators that might be listening to this and being like, yes, no, this was not something we discussed in undergrad, or maybe I went back for a master's and we still didn't discuss this. But if we have classroom teachers that are listening right now and they're like, yes, I own it. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of teaching writing. I started my teaching career as a sixth grade reading and language arts teacher. And I remember looking at writing and being like, whew, this is just a little bit of a heavier lift. I'm not really sure as I'm grading these or trying to give feedback. It was just like, again, just broader, not. And so I think you kind of tend to be like, okay, yeah, if we don't have time today, this is the thing that I'm going to kind of let, slip. Any recommendations? Because you mentioned confidence, the importance of
Hmm.
being confident and telling yourself you're a writer and modeling that for students, modeling
Yes.
that focus and all of those pieces. Any recommendations of, just getting started for teachers that are in classroom that are maybe recognizing, yes, writing, I've been really focused on reading or making these changes and writing's kind of, you know, sitting over here and I know I need to get to it, but where do I start?
Absolutely. And it's a very appropriate question because the research shows us that not only is writing instruction for future educators lower prioritized, we've seen research from both the side of university professors saying, I don't prepare teachers because
Mhm.
I'm not even confident. And, also from the teachers reflecting on their preparation. So all of that to say the majority of teachers are learning writing instruction through PD. That is what is
Yep.
still, as the most current research shows, that is what is still happening. I hope to see, the tide turn a little bit when it comes to that, but we have a long way to go. Um, so I think a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier, like you said, are going to be applicable to in-service as well as pre-service teachers because the teachers in the classroom today just lack that preparation as well. So turning toward professional development and understanding that that is the place where most of these teachers are going to have the opportunity to learn more about writing instruction, I think really diving deep into the reading writing connection and understanding we can provide incredible writing instruction using curricula that the district has already spent money on because they do tend to be reluctant to make big switches because programs and
Yes.
curriculum are
Mhm.
very expensive. Um, we can bring certain practices in. So, looking into what those practices could be, we can bring writing instruction directly into a literacy block. It doesn't necessarily have to be segregated into reading and writing, although in the lower grades that might be most appropriate when we're building those foundational skills. But there's a lot of overlap that I mentioned earlier, even with basic phonics instruction and spelling being
Right.
a good area to overlap.
Mhm.
But I think one of the main things that seems to be really eye-opening to teachers that I've spoken with is understanding that writing, if you're set up in a writing workshop model or a literacy workshop model, which a lot of schools still are, we can do excellent things in that structure as well. But that doesn't mean that's the only time we're reading, and it doesn't mean that's the only time we're
Right.
writing. So we need to understand anytime we can engage in cross-curricular instruction, we are
Mhm.
benefiting our students tremendously. So that could potentially look like selecting text during reading workshop and then, perhaps responding to a prompt during writing workshop that are based in science or social studies that tie
Right.
together to that. Or if you have that time in your day set aside when you're teaching science and you're teaching social studies, what does that writing activity look like that you're having the students do? I know one of the programs that I was familiar with in science instruction did a lot with journal writing as students were getting their hands-on experience with their experiments and learning all the fun things that you can do in science. Then they had to write about it, writing out their steps. That's still teaching them a different type of text structure and a genre of writing.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
I think teachers are probably doing more than they recognize they are because they're
Right.
isolating in their minds. When do I teach writing? I teach it from 10:30 to 11 or whatever that time might be. And we know in a lot of self-reporting surveys that have been done with teachers that they're reporting very little writing instruction. I'm optimistic that they're underreporting and not recognizing the writing that they're providing. But at the same time, there's so much opportunity for overlap in bringing the literacy skills into the content areas. Um, literacy, I'm going to be my literacy person, and it's appropriate on this podcast. It's the foundation of everything else. How can we
Yes.
do anything else when we don't have reading and writing? And so often, um, literacy is thought first as reading only
Reading,
instruction,
right.
and we don't really
Mhm.
elevate writing to that. I'm going to quote Laura Brief here, who's the CEO of 826 National. I'm not sure how familiar listeners might be or viewers might be with that. But she said, reading is access. So we do need to build strong readers. That's how our children, our future generations learn to access. But writing is power because that allows them to engage in it. And I love that quote, and I will
I love
continue to
that.
quote her.
Yes.
So, because I think it really highlights how important it is to make sure we are elevating both and
Mhm.
understanding the interactions. It's really hard to parse it out, but I feel like the more blurred we make it, the better job we're doing at it. If we can say like, well, of course, reading always involves writing something about what we read,
Yes.
then we're making some progress. So I hope that
Yeah,
that's
I
a way that
love
we can
that.
continue.
And I think that's an easier lift too, right? So
Hmm.
as you mentioned, maybe we're underreporting how much,
Yeah,
writing is
I hope so.
occurring. And then as we think about those steps, just recognizing it and finding again, as we think about those threads, some pieces that we can work on and for students to see that this is not something that we do. I think that's one of the most important things too, as we think about reading and we think about writing, is at the end of the day, we don't want teacher or students to think this is what we do in this box and this is what we do in this box and this, right? This is to allow you to be successful in the future and gain information and be entertained as well. But as you said, I love that the writing is the power, right? That's
Yeah.
going to allow you to share what you have learned. Well, I could continue to talk to you and ask so many more questions. You are so insightful, so grateful that our listeners get to listen and learn from you. Um, the one I'll ask just one more question as a takeaway. So
Mhm.
you've shared a lot of practical ways to get started. If if you were to give advice to teachers of like this is your first step, what would you say that would be? If
I
they
would
could take one
encourage
thing away from listening to this.
Well, I appreciate that. And this is not necessarily a new a repetition of a takeaway, but perhaps new. I think that teachers need to voice their need for
Yes.
professional development in this area to their administrators. I know that there are a lot of districts that have elevated writing as a focal point because writing scores are not great. That there's also a problem with how often are we even assessing writing. That's a whole different thing that I won't get off
That's what
into
popped
right
into
now.
my head as you said that. I'm like, "Yep,
Yes.
yep." Once that
So,
started to dwindle, so did
yeah,
writing instruction. Yes. Mhm.
absolutely. Or at least it just never grew as we'd hoped it would.
Yes.
But I think that administrators and districts have the power to really help their teachers, especially those that didn't receive the writing instruction they felt that they needed to feel more
Mhm.
confident in how to teach the content and how to teach it, the pedagogical side. So I think that districts looking into PD options, there are so many different things available out there, um, which I'm sure you guys have a lot of resources that you'll link as well.
Yeah.
But they're school-wide, district-wide approaches are going to build the camaraderie among the teachers that are learning it for the first time. I tell my students all the time, teachers don't work in silos. We like to have
Right.
people to work together with. Collaboration is key to what we do every day with our students, and that includes our own learning. So I think the more
Right.
it can be raised at minimally a grade level, maybe even a building level, ideally an entire district level, making writing a priority and providing that PD to teachers is going to help them build on each other's strengths. Um, as well as have more voices to bounce ideas off of
Mhm.
and to raise you up when you're feeling a little frustrated.
Right.
so
Yeah.
so
Uh,
I think that it is a
Absolutely.
big lift and it's a big ask for administrators to take on yet another thing, but I know that they prioritize different areas of instruction every year as part of
Mhm.
their district goals. And so if writing is something that, especially if your teachers are coming to you and saying, we need this. So I would
Yeah.
encourage teachers to seek out what they can, ideally uh, through a district would be great. So,
I love that. Um, just again, because even with undergrad, even if you have a strong undergrad program,
mhm,
right? When you have walk into your classroom, every classroom looks different. All the needs are different. And
yes.
so as we, think about PD, as you said, we don't want to work in silos, right? We want to be
Hmm.
able to work with others, problem solve with others. And that was such a wonderful piece of advice. Thank you so much for being a guest today. We really appreciate your time and our listeners getting to learn from you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we explore literacy topics in a snack-sized, easily digestible format.